I want to focus my intervention on a couple of points that I'm quite troubled about, and they have to do with this bill, and I know that my intervention must be focused on this bill, and it will be. But I'm particularly concerned with the way this government is prepared to move things through at a pace that is contrary to the rules of this House, that is, frankly, flies in the face of the concerns that are brought to this House by members of Parliament from all sides as a result of discussions that we've had with Canadians. And what we see with Bill C-11, we saw it today when the government House Leader introduced time allocation motion, in other words, limiting debate once again for, I believe it's the 23rd time that such closure motions, time allocation motions have been brought into this House in just a year, a little more than a year that we've been here. And there aren't very many pieces of legislation that this government have been prepared to say to members of this House, well, you know what, you, member from Dartmouth-Cole Harbour or whomever, were elected by Canadian voters just as we were. We recognize your role. We recognize the role of Parliament, all members of this House, not just government members. The right of all members is to represent your constituents, to bring their concerns, to use your intellect and your advice and your experience to examine each and every piece of legislation within the confines of the general rules of practice and procedure. Unfortunately, however, this government, we see it again with Bill C-11, this government believes that not in a democracy, not in a parliamentary democracy, but in something different, something that is almost leaning towards a dictatorship, in that it's a dictatorship by the PMO, by the Prime Minister's office. They decide, not the rules that govern procedure in this House, but the PMO decides when enough is enough, when we've had enough debate or discussion about a particular issue. The Conservative member who spoke previously got up and he listed off the number of witnesses that have been heard, the number of people that have intervened. The parliamentary secretary this morning, or the government House Leader this morning, when he introduced his limitation on our debate on Bill C-11, talked about how many hours we've already talked about this, and that, you know, it's been here in a previous Parliament, a similar piece of legislation. Therefore, we've already been there, done that. Let's get it over with, and let's just run it through. But, Madam Speaker, what that ignores, of course, again, for the 23rd time, this government has brought in some restriction imposed with their majority, some restriction on my right and the rights of my colleagues who have contrary positions to fully debate at each and every stage a piece of legislation. They've said, and they will decide whether a piece of legislation is good. And you know what? I've heard in committee, I've heard in this chamber, many members opposite say, you know what, we think this is the way things should be done. You think the other way. You're going to bring in people, or you're going to listen to experts who don't agree with us, but it frankly doesn't matter because we have the majority and we're going to have our way. They very much begrudge us taking any time in this House to offer opinions which are in any way opposed to this government. We've seen it. We've seen how this government, they broke no opposition. The National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy had the audacity to offer positions based on evidence, based on fact, based on science that are contrary to the PMO, to their vision of the world. And so guess what? All the good work, all the evidence, all the science, all the time and energy spent discussing with Canadians important issues about the environment, about the economy, that body is no longer there. As was suggested by my colleague, the member from Halifax, yesterday, she said this government and the Minister of the Environment and the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, very much believes that they don't need to have expert panels. They don't need to have expert advice. They don't need scientists because they have the internet. They can Google it. They can go on Wikipedia and get the answers to their questions. And the beauty of that is Wikipedia, if they don't agree with what says in Wikipedia, they'll just go on and change it. It doesn't have to be based on evidence. It doesn't have to be based on science. Madam Speaker, they will just simply change it. I find it extraordinarily distasteful. It's creating bad policy, frankly. I have some experience in dealing with legislation, and I know from experience that if you don't take time, if you don't consider alternative opinions, if you don't pore over legislation, various provisions within, with a fine-tooth comb, inevitably there will be mistakes. We've seen examples of that already in this House, where the government has had to withdraw legislation because it was so bad. They passed legislation through this House. They broke no amendments. They would entertain no changes. They would not listen to any of our arguments or the arguments in the Senate, for heaven's sakes, that suggested that that piece of legislation needed correction, and as a result, they ended up having to make changes afterwards. They made changes afterwards because they didn't want to make changes in here. They didn't want to show this place any respect that there may be an idea that they might have been wrong on something, that they may not have exactly and specifically considered all sides of a particular argument, and so they rammed it through and then had to make changes afterwards. And my concern is that that was, in that case, it was most obvious and egregious weakness in that particular piece of legislation. With something like Bill C-11 that is so technical and wide-reaching in terms of its implication, this government will drive it through without considering our amendments. We brought in 17 amendments at committee that were ignored. Amendments that meant to establish a balance, Madam Speaker, and they were ignored. But members opposite like to suggest that that there is no opposition out there. There is no other way. And I just want to, if I may, read into the record a couple of experts, and there are many who have indicated their. How much time do I have, Madam Speaker? 11 seconds. Well, maybe in response to some of the members' questions, I will have the opportunity to introduce some of the people that have problems with this particular legislation, and I call on all members to take your time, recognize this is important, give it the kind of scrutiny it deserves.